and welcome to the York Festival Ideas. What I think is going to be a really, really interesting hour talking about public attitudes towards harassment of British MPs. My name is Peter Geoghegan. I'm a writer and a journalist, and I'm the editor of Political Insight magazine, which is the political studies of the UK's Political Studies Association, the UK's quarterly magazine. And I'm delighted to be here with you tonight for what I think should be a really, really interesting event. And before we go on to introduce our speakers and our topic, I just wanted to kind of give a couple of technical notes. So just to say, subtitles are available in this event. So to turn these on or off, if you use the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen, you'll just see it on the little Zoom icons. If you switch on CC Show Captions, you'll get subtitles. Hopefully it can pick up my Irish accent, which hasn't changed too much. It's still quite strong. And if you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. I would encourage you to do so. The opportunity to put questions in is available throughout the event. We'll have lots of time for questions. So just, as and when, please just put them in, post them anytime, and we will hopefully, I'm sure, get a chance to answer those. And also just to remind you that tonight's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again, which is great. So it'll all be uploaded as well. And tonight, as I say, we are discussing this issue of public attitudes towards the harassment of British MPs. I think it's a really important issue, and it's an idea of how does the public perceive the problem of threats and abuse towards parliamentarians and parliamentary candidates. We've seen some horrific examples of abuse towards MPs in recent years. The murders of Jo Cox and David Amess obviously are very much still in our thoughts. They're real tragedies. But also the daily abuse that members of Parliament receive online and often in person as well. And one of the things we're going to be, I think, trying to do in unpicking this in this hour is to ask, to what extent does the general public tolerate the abuse and harassment of MPs? Does this kind of counter-narrative messaging reduce this tolerance, this sense in which I think MPs are often seen as public representatives that are just there for people to treat as they want? And there was a really interesting piece that these authors actually wrote for Political Insight last year on this very subject. And I think their research is really interesting. And we're talking about their research today. They've been doing some really important research in this area. I think it's fair to say it has some really surprising findings as well when we think about how the British public thinks about harassment of its MPs. So I think it should be a very, very interesting debate and discussion here. And to explore this really important topic, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Graeme Davies, who's professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. Graeme's research examines the relationship between domestic politics and state behaviour in the international system. I'd like to be able to say where they are on my screen, but I'm sure everyone's screen is different, so I won't try and do that. We've also got Robert Johns, who's a professor of politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Southampton. Robert has 20 years experience of research and teaching in the fields of elections, public opinion, political psychology and survey methodology. I'm also delighted to welcome Sarah Shair-Rosenfield, who's professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York as well. So it's good to have some good York representation here. Sarah's research focuses on comparative political institutions with a special interest in the link between gender and political representation. And last but by no means least, we've got Reid Wood, who's Professor of International Relations in the Department of Government at the University of Essex. Reid's research investigates the complex interconnections between gender and political violence and its implications for politics and society. And I'm sure as this conversation unspools, we'll be hearing a lot about the different areas of expertise and how these all come to play in this issue of researching and trying to understand both the public's attitude towards harassment of MPs and what might be done about this issue. But I want to kick it off actually by turning to you, Rob. You guys you've been looking at this area. Why do you think it's important to study how the British public thinks about the tolerance of abuse and harassment towards MPs and candidates at election time?
There are two questions really here. Why should we care about the issue? And then why should we care about the public's view? On this issue. I'm not going to spend long on the first one, partly because Peter's already spelled out, the human cost of this. We could also talk about the fact that the surge in violence, and although it's difficult to measure, it does seem that there has been a surge in both incidents and violence, and certainly in violent threats. It does deter people from coming forward to stand for election, and it deters certain types of people in particular, and they're usually the kinds of people who are thinnest on the ground in our democracies. So there's lots of reasons to suppose this matters. For the question of why should we care what the public think? I always find that a difficult question to answer because I'm interested in what the public think regardless. There's no question at which I wouldn't point a survey or a survey experiment of the kind that you'll be seeing. But I am heartened by the fact that people who've turned up tonight must already be somewhat on board with the idea that it matters. But I will try to give two reasons in particular why we should care what the public thinks about this. The first of which is to do with understanding where the violence comes from in the first place, and the other of which is really to do with the role of public opinion itself, the role and steadfastness of norms in minimizing that violence. The first one really comes out of the distinction in attempts to understand political violence between a kind of, I'm going to simplify fairly grotesquely here, but bear with me. There are, broadly speaking, a kind of lone wolf model of political violence. And then there is more of a pyramid model where the people who commit the violence are at the very top, but of a pyramid of usually ideological or it could be religious sympathies. And at the bottom of that pyramid is the public or that sector of the public that shares that persuasion. Now, these are obviously very different kind of models. When people have done studies of terrorism, they've tended to find that the lone wolf model doesn't work very well. It's more of a kind of school shooting kind of thing. And that's one possibility, that the people who attack MPs are in those terms kind of operating as atoms on their own. So Anders Breivik, for example, yes, he attacked a Social Democratic Party youth event, but there were psychological reports on him from the age of 4. And it seems like that was the thing. It wasn't just that he really didn't like social democracy. But you might think, well, that sounds less plausible than the pyramid model, given that we're in a time of for Britain, extreme political polarization. There clearly is a lot of ideological hate out there. And so it's not at all hard to imagine that, it might be I kind of know my audience, so I'll take the example this way round, that it's the extreme leaver who is the one who attacks the Remain sympathetic MP, but they are part of a pyramid of Leave support, and there are pyramids on both sides of this and any polarizing issue. Now, evidence from recent studies of political violence do tend to point to something a bit more lone wolfy in the case of political violence, or to put it more specifically, the dark triad of personality that's kind of psychopathy and narcissism and Machiavellianism, things that are not tied to any particular political ideology. And it doesn't look as if people who, just because they are on the same ideological side as somebody who commits political violence, that they are likely to support that. But it certainly seems important to us, partly because we as academics always want to understand this stuff, to be able to distinguish between which of those models is best describing the extreme cases of violence that we're seeing. And so it's difficult not to be slightly loosely sometimes talking about the violence as in the acts themselves, for example, the murders of Jo Cox or David Amess, and then there's the violent threats, which we'll be looking at more in terms of the data that we collected. But if you go with this reservoir of support model, they're both part of the same thing. It also matters which of those models is right for the kind of policy prescriptions, because obviously the implications in particular for politicians and the need to restrain rhetoric are very different if they're implicated in the kind of pyramidal model. Whereas it's difficult to see what to do, but there are certainly different types of prescriptions if it's more of a lone wolf kind of situation. But the other reason why understanding that matters is going to bring me to the second reason why public opinion here matters. Because the question of whether political violence is really only the province of some pretty kind of extreme personalities and a, and a mercifully rare situations like that, as opposed to being basically tacitly condoned by everybody who's got ideological sympathies with the committer of a violence, is really important for the way that the public see the public. And it'll sound a bit odd or circular, this, because I'm basically saying that public opinion really matters for public opinion. But when you think of public opinion as a kind of norm, then it starts to make sense that what people perceive as being normal is really important here. And the more people who see political violence as being a kind of beyond the pale, the less political violence there will be. And you can, it's a misguided to see, for example, the murder of David Amess as the breaking of a norm against political violence. Actually, the reactions to those can show the strength of those norms. But again, the incidence of violence really matters here. So that raises the question, how does the public know what public opinion is? How do they know how people react to this? It's not like polls where we have every few days a reading of public opinion. They have to kind of infer public opinion. They have to infer how strong the norms are against violence. And the problem is that violence, because it is mercifully rare, is more noticeable. Nobody goes on social media and sees a response to a politician and thinks, oh, that was a vehement but non-violent disagreement. They notice when the violence happens. And nobody says, oh, that MP's surgery was very convivial and everybody dispersed happily. You think about the cases where the threats happen. And of course, the media, it's not in a way their fault, but the violence is the man bites dog thing, not the non-violence is the boring dog bites man, nothing to report here. And so, in a way, I don't think it's too strong to suggest there has been something of a moral panic about this issue. Now, moral panics aren't always wrong, but I think that some of the media reaction could lead the public to believe that there is a lot of sympathy for political violence out there. And that would matter a lot. There's not much evidence specifically in our context on this, but there is quite a lot of evidence from the context of democratic norms and democratic backsliding that we are less committed to democracy ourselves as individuals, the more we doubt others' commitment to it. There was a great study in Canada, a similar case to Britain in a number of ways, and I suspect we would find similar results, where they did two surveys a few months apart. And in the first one, they asked people how much they agreed or disagreed with statements like those on the losing side of an election must always respect the process and accept the outcome, or elected politicians shouldn't interfere in court decisions, and so on. In the second survey, they were told the results from the whole of the public from the first survey. And some people were being told that actually the democratic norm was much stronger than they had believed, whereas other people were told that it was rather weaker. They might have been a bit surprised by how few people supported the democratic norm. But the point was, what you learned about public opinion shaped what you then subsequently said about that question. And it even mattered which way round you presented the same data. So if you said 80% of people agree with this norm, you would strengthen the norm. Whereas if you said 20% of people disagree with it, you condone that disagreement. Now, this is basically leading us to want to be able to say X% of people in Britain think that making a violent threat in a tweet to an MP is completely unacceptable. Now, we wanted that percentage to be high, partly for obvious reasons, but partly because we thought this would contribute to strengthening the norms. And this is a kind of project that it's not a project in which we're scrupulously neutral in the sense of not minding what happens. We did want to we did want heartening results. And also, as you'll see later, we wanted to find the messages that could strengthen those norms further. So I think without further ado, I've heralded enough results now. You probably want some. So I'll pass on. Thanks very much.
I do. Thank you very much. And I might take this as an opportunity actually to bring in Sarah to talk maybe a bit more about what the results were and the kind of the process, the kind of how you approach this process of studying this topic of harassment amongst the British public.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. And thanks again, everyone, for having us. So you might be thinking to yourself, this is a difficult topic to just ask people about, right? Can you just ask people, well, do you tolerate abusive language being targeted towards a candidate or an MP? Do you tolerate them having someone show up at their house? And I think quite rightly, this is a difficult question to ask because first, a lot of people will honestly say, no, it's not okay. It's not acceptable behavior. I definitely think it shouldn't happen. But then we also have a lot of what's called social desirability bias. This is a phenomenon we notice in public opinion research that if you ask people a question where they say what they think they should say, what seems morally or ethically justifiable, then that's the answer they're going to give you when you ask them a point blank question, such as, do you think that people should be allowed to send abusive letters to their MP or show up and write abusive messages on their front door, right? And so we had to find a sort of more nuanced way or a more technical way of asking about these things than just saying, how do you feel about the topic? And so in this sense, what we did was we chose to embed what's called an experiment within a survey. So we actually ran, hopefully you can all see my screen, we ran a three-wave set of surveys. The first wave we fielded actually in the week running up to the general election last year, late June, early July. We then ran a second wave, a much larger wave on sort of a slightly different set of questions and experimental treatments in mid-January of this year. And then as a result of those two, we actually included additional questions and treatments about what's called a counter-narrative message. And I'll leave that to colleagues to speak about that. But that ran immediately after the second wave in late January. And you can see we've got quite a lot of respondents. Today, what we're going to do is mostly focus on the results from one particular one, wave two, which is our largest wave. And I'll note one other thing about these surveys. In order to make sure we're really capturing the British public, these are also surveys that in each stage are what are called nationally representative. So we recruited respondents through a platform, an online platform called Prolific. And Prolific can allow us to get weights for the age, sex, and ethnicity of respondents so that we match the basic demographics of the British population. So in each of these waves, we have a population that resembles the British population, kind of scaled down to the size that we could use. Now, in order to get around this question about how do you ask people in an indirect way how they feel about abuse towards an MP, what we did was created a vignette. So in this case, the vignette looks a little bit something like a formerly Twitter, now X post. And what it has is it has a picture of an MP. Well, I'll go ahead and just show you. It has a picture of a candidate or an MP, all hypothetical. So these are fictional individuals, along with a message, a party label, and then two responses below, right? And so you can see this in each of these. And so I don't want you to have to try and struggle to read. It's a lot of text, but all of the posts were either about immigration or climate action. And in the posts that the results we're going to show you are predominantly about immigration. And then what you have at the bottom are the two responses. The first response is a very innocuous response. You really have no idea what you're talking about. But the second response I want to draw your attention to, this is the response that really kind of focuses on the idea that the type of abuse that MPs and candidates face online can become, in fact, more than just innocuously rude or mean, but can actually borderline become violent, right? And so in this case, it's you should stop running off your stupid mouth. If someone dropped by your home with a knife, they'd be doing us all a favor, right? So this is a only sort of thinly veiled violent threat. And so what we had after this was then a series of questions about the sort of general tone of the post, but explicitly asking a series of questions about the second response, its acceptability, its understandability, whether or not people believe that it broke the rules of the social media platform that it was posted on. And so this is sort of our way of getting to this. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do you get the sort of experimental part? And what we did was we varied in these posts different content, right? So we varied whether the post was pro or anti-immigration. We varied whether the person running was Labor or conservative. We varied whether or not the person running was a man or a woman. And we varied whether or not the person was Black or white. We also, in the sort of survey that we're going to talk about here, varied whether or not the post was about immigration or about climate action or net zero. And by varying all of these things, what we can get at is whether or not the public tolerates this type of abuse, but also whether that tolerance varies depending on the type of person being asked about. Now, in the very first of those three studies that I showed you, we actually varied the second response. So they're seeing the violent second response. We had a series of responses that were also nonviolent, and we were able to compare the two. And so some of the baseline things we're going to talk about in terms of results stem from the fact that a significantly higher portion of people who saw this violent threat thought that the post was inappropriate and broke the rules of the platform than those who saw the nonviolent. Now, in the final study, which we'll only briefly touch on, but which relates to this question about counter narratives, is Rob was mentioning that, we want to know whether or not there's this sort of broader ability of knowing about public opinion to sway public opinion, right? If we give you information that says that others don't believe this is acceptable or others don't like this behavior, will that actually help shape or encourage people to also not be tolerant of it? And so in the final study, what we did was we took this same basic post and then we added an additional third response. And the third response varied in tone and content. And so you can see here the third response is a very sort of empathetic oriented response. I'm no fan of this politician, but you've gone way too far here. Imagine how scared you or your kids would be if they read that someone threatened to knife you, right? It's designed to evoke empathy for the person who originally made the post. And to sort of call attention to the fact that that second response was problematic in the eyes of this particular person who posted. And so in the final study that we did, we varied these types of counter-narrative messages to try and understand whether these messages actually helped to encourage people to think about the second response as being abusive, a problem, rule-breaking, whether they would be likely to report it, whether it would help them encourage thinking about greater degrees of regulation, either by social media platforms or the government. And we tried to also understand whether these different types of messages had a different ability to sway people's perspective about these things, right? So the question about whether or not public opinion can help shape public opinion is done through the lens of this particular type of message. And these tend to reflect what a lot of policy interventions look like in the real world. And so one of the reasons to do this is to really understand whether this type of messaging, in fact, can influence people who might otherwise have been sort of uncertain how problematic that second response was, to think, no, I thought it was problematic and clearly this other person did too. So maybe I should really think about how I should respond. And so this is how we did it. And all of the survey respondents saw one of the different treatments and then answered again a series of questions designed to understand whether or not they believed that this type of response was inappropriate, whether this type of response maybe suggested that more regulation would be warranted. And so I think this is kind of a good time for me to wrap up. I'll pass back to you, Peter, so someone can talk about what we actually found.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think I would like to kind of start to talk a bit more actually about the actual findings, just to kind of really to unpick a bit more. Like maybe if we say there was a couple of key findings, and maybe I'll bring you in now, Reid. If there's a couple of key findings from the study, what would you flag?
So yeah, thank you, Peter, and thanks everybody for being here. I have the fun part because I get to present our findings, which is the exciting part for political scientists, right? We run the experiment, we take all the time to develop the infrastructure and think through the questions, and that takes months and months, and then we field the survey, and then finally we get to start looking at the data. And so here I get to talk about the cool relationships we find, and this in many ways is the happy slide, right? These are some very positive findings, or at least I think we can think of them this way, because like Rob said, one of the reasons we're interested in this is because norms matter. We know that. Norms are a reflection to some degree of public agreement over ideas and practices. And to some extent, shifts in public opinion reflect shifts in norms. And what we would hope is that in general, people find violent threats against MPs to be unacceptable behavior and contrary to the democratic norms that I think everybody in this room thinks are critical for our society. And so if you look at so these are just the general findings from among all respondents when we ask them 3 questions to gauge how they feel about the violent response that they read. Again, all the respondents in our survey saw the same violent response. We varied the candidate and some aspects of the candidate and their message, but this is just the response to aggregated across all of the different candidate types, all of the different messages. but all the candidates, all the respondents saw the same violent post. So this is their attitude toward the violent post. And happily, what we see is something on the order of 93% of respondents believed that the violent post broke the rules of the social media platform. So the first thing we know is that people recognize that bad behavior, threatening behavior, violence directed towards a political candidate is contrary to the rules. We don't know exactly whether they're responding exactly to their responding about their perception of the rules on the platform per se, or kind of their broader beliefs about it breaking rules of society. We did ask them specifically about the rules of the platform. But what we can take away from this is that most of them are aware that that kind of behavior is not acceptable. It breaks the rules in the platform. So that's a good thing. If you look at the opposite side, the bothered by the exchange, I'll move to that one, even though it's out of order. We wanted to know just how bothered they were by the response, right? Just as a gauge of, their level of comfort. Does viewing this material make you feel uncomfortable? This is maybe less positive because what we find is less positive, but still positive overall, right? We find that something on the order of 70 to 75%, I guess that's about 73% of respondents were actually bothered by viewing the threat, right? So 3 out of 4 respondents in our survey were concerned or bothered by viewing that kind of threatening messaging on a social media platform. So generally good, although that leaves 1 in 4 are unbothered by it. We assume that's probably because of the level of exposure they've had to this kind of, uncivil or threatening messaging on social media. And then in the middle, the column there, the bar there, is the result of asking them if they saw that message on a social media platform that they viewed, would they report it to the social media platform, right? So we know already that most people knew that it broke the rules or perceived it to break the rules. We would hope that most then would go ahead and report, because that might lead the social media platform to remove the violent post. But we find that only about 65, 67% would actually report it. Right, they agree that they would report it. So a little less optimism there. What this doesn't show, and we're trying to tease out in later studies, is the reason that they wouldn't report. Whether it's because, as we see in the other column, they're just not bothered by it, or is it because they don't think that enough would be done anyway? So this leads us to kind of the second set of results, which is how they think other actors, such as the social media company itself or potentially the government, should respond to violent or threatening messages. And this, we were also, I think, heartened to some degree by this, that in general, our respondents, the majority of our respondents wanted there to be some intervention to remove the threatening posts, and in many cases to punish the perpetrators. So you see in the first bar there that we asked the question whether users should be removed from the social media platform generally. So if someone posts an image like they saw in the experiment, or sorry, post a threat, threatens to knife an MP or a political candidate, should they be removed? And we have 85% of people think they should be removed. So this is good finding. There's desire for those individuals to be removed. It also kind of cuts against some of the free speech arguments that social media companies and others have used, saying that, well, this is just something we all have to tolerate, and it's what the public wants in a democratic society because we need to have open and free debate. Well, actually, 85% think that people who make threats on social media should be removed. They should be kicked off the platform. So, that might be a good thing. There's, again, this shows there's limited tolerance broadly in society for, or at least in British society, for threatening and violent posts. Interestingly, we also find that most respondents, close to 90%, think that social media companies should be primarily responsible for removing those users. And then more than 75% think that the government should actually prosecute and ban users. And this is particularly interesting because, and particularly relevant if we think back to the riots and violent protests last year, right? And the debate surrounding the Labour government's decision to, press hard to prosecute individuals who were posting disinformation and threatening messages on social media and in other venues at that time. There's actually significant public support for that type of response. So these are just our overall findings. Just really quickly, because I know we have limited time, I want to show how some of our experimental treatments affected the way individuals thought about these questions. So what we have here on the left side is you'll see the different candidate attributes or message attributes that were included in the experiment. So we have whether the candidate was female or male, whether it was a black candidate or a white candidate, Labor candidate versus a conservative candidate, or whether the post was about immigration or climate change. And what we find are those characteristics some of those characteristics at least, do shape the way people think about regulation and how violent content should be regulated. So first, interestingly, we find a strongly gendered effect. So when the target of the threat is a female candidate, respondents are significantly more likely to want to remove users. I'm sorry, I should back up and actually explain this figure a little bit. These are the results of some statistical analyses we ran. What you should take away from this is that if you see the red line in the middle of each of those charts, if the bars that you see are fully to one side or the other, that means that it's a statistically significant effect of that characteristic. And if it's on the right side, it's positive, meaning that, take, for example, female candidate. If we look at the first row for female candidate, it means that because the bar is to the right side of that red line, seeing a female candidate increased the respondents' belief that users should be removed when they post violent content. And that's the case for the other outcomes as well. So those bars are on the right-hand side of the red line, meaning that it's a positive effect. Seeing a female candidate increased a desire to remove users, belief that companies are responsible for moving users, and a belief that governments should prosecute users who post threatening material. So if we look then at the black candidate treatment, so compared to a white candidate, there's really not much of effect. There's slightly a weak effect in the right side chart there. So when respondents saw the black candidate, they were slightly more likely to believe that government should prosecute, but it didn't affect their belief about removal or companies' responsibility. Similarly, Labor candidate, not much of an effect, only a little bit about the companies being responsible. So that's sort of a wash. We did find that when the post had to deal with immigration, which we know is a kind of a hot button issue and kind of gets the blood boiling for many individuals, it's a topic of intense debate. They were somewhat more tolerant of the posts and less likely to think that the violent user should be removed, or that companies are responsible, or that government should prosecute, right? And we can tell that because the bars are fully to the left side of that red line. So hopefully that wasn't too technical, and I'll be happy to talk more about those in the Q&A.
No, really, I think that was very interesting. I thought you've explained it very, very well. I think it's, even for the lay people out there, I think we're coming away with a better sense of how that all works. And as we've got a couple of questions in already, so please be thinking about your questions. Please put your questions in. We'll address them towards the end of the panel. But just yeah, I think there's lots of things here that hopefully will spur people to ask some interesting questions. And I guess in terms of like the work itself, right now I'd like to bring in Graeme to kind of ask about, like, what would you say, Graeme, are the key kind of policy implications from this study, from the work that you guys have been doing?
Okay, thanks so much. I'll just go through a few implications, and Ben, feel free to ask any questions. So I'll outline a few thoughts about the policy implications of our findings. So when we began the project, we were very keen to think about how we can contribute towards the social good. So specifically, we're interested in examining how we can reduce support for online violence towards political candidates, what measures can be taken in place to sort of mitigate those effects, and whether we could advise government in approaches they could take. So I'm going to break the tour with my section into a couple of areas. But first, I want to look at the counter-narratives that are being discussed that try to reduce approval for threats of violence against politicians. And then I'll move on to examine public approval for regulation of social media companies. And I think those are the sort of two areas where we could talk about sort of policy implications. So if we look at the counter-narratives, okay, so we looked at the counter-narratives, and I hope that they can highlight the consequences of threats, violent threats, which we were hoping in turn would reduce public tolerance for those threats. So when respondents in the experiments were given the threat condition where the threat was made, some of them were given the condition where a counter narrative was put underneath. Someone would respond to that and say, it was an unreasonable statement to make, and highlight some issue which we would then hope would resonate with the respondents or the public and reduce their support for conflict. So we look basically at about 4 areas. So we look at empathy towards the candidate's family. So respondents would, in the treatment, would say, in the experiment treatment, someone would say underneath the threat, you've got to think about the family here, the candidate's family, their children, how would you like this? We then gave another one about even-handedness, which is saying, well, violence not only affects people you disagree with, but also the politicians you agree with. So the people making threats of violence against, a Remainer, they may also make threats against a Leaver, right? So to try and make people understand, well, if we're contaminating the political discourse with violence, it has an equal effect on both sides. Then we talk about norm compliance, and this is some of the issues we've been discussing earlier about, public opinion, influencing public opinion. I mean, say something like norm compliance message, but well, to be honest, most people don't really sort of make this threat, and it's not, it's not generally approved of. Try and give a sense of, okay, this isn't normal, this is not normal behavior. And then the final one we look at is the effect on democracy. So we sort of say a counter narrative which says, well, good people won't run for office if all this violence is going around, and that's kind of what we want in sort of politics. So we sort of give these different counter narratives to try and mitigate the effects of the violence and try and make people more concerned about the violence. And we see the results here, and I won't go through the results in specifically, except one broad conclusion. But unfortunately, we found that specific counter narratives had very little effect on those people who felt that threats of violence were acceptable against political candidates. So whatever the counter narrative was, it didn't really make a difference to reporting, how bothered they were, how understanding they were. Generally, the counter narrative was relatively ineffective. Okay, so when we mentioned empathy towards candidate's family, the effect of violence on democracy, on normal compliance, on even-handedness, response were generally unmoved. And I think one policy implication from this, potentially, is it has broad implications for the use of counter narratives by government, right, in their social media campaigns. But often maybe, they're not as effective as they might think they are. Now, there may be some reasons for this. These findings may simply be down, or the lack of findings may simply be down to the fact that the overwhelming majority of people felt that threats of violence were unacceptable. And thus they really just didn't need the nudge. And then those who felt the threats were acceptable were so few in our sample that actually it wasn't a big enough sample for us to actually detect whether these counter narratives actually nudged them at all. So in essence, some groups of people were already persuaded about the unacceptability of threats, where other groups were generally hard to persuade. It may also signify that countering support for violence might need more than a short statement, right, which we find there. So there's a lot to think about there in terms of a communications and a messaging campaign. So in terms of policy, there's little evidence in our project suggests that a government communications campaign will make any difference to attitudes towards the approval for threats against candidates. Where we do find stronger evidence for policy recommendations is on public support for regulation. So as Reid highlighted before, the public view that social media platforms are responsible for violent conduct posted online. They also strongly support the removal of violent threats from platforms, and that social media companies should be held responsible for doing that. The majority of the public felt that social media companies should be held liable for any violence that results from online conduct, and that the government should fine social media companies who fail to remove that content. We found that people are less willing to report violent content because they themselves believe that social media companies will tend to do nothing about it. Okay? They also believe that this content is kind of normal, which is something we were trying to undermine with the norm compliance. So to encourage the public to report violent threats against candidates, they need to believe that something will be done with their complaints. And I think some of the thoughts we had with this project was that the government has a place here to sort of help persuade, force social media companies to act and to be seen to be acting, which in turn will affect the public and make them more likely to report. So we have 3 policy recommendations. Firstly, there is strong support for public holding companies liable. So the government should not be timid when creating laws that make platforms accountable for violent threats against candidates. Secondly, there's strong public support for prosecuting and fining companies that fail to remove or restrict violent content. Another policy implication could be that the government should not be shy about prosecuting companies failing to remove this content. The public will support that prosecution. And thirdly, there's a willingness to hold social media companies liable for real acts of violence against candidates that may have been inspired by online messages of hate. So there's more of a consequences for the social media companies in relation to physical violence. So overall, we believe that results suggest that the public is supportive of more government regulation of social media and have a greater willingness to use legal mechanisms to hold those companies to account for what happens in both the online and in the physical world. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Graeme, thank you so much. It's a really interesting wrap up. Thank you. It's fascinating stuff. We've got some questions. I have my own questions too, if I get a chance. But I feel like I might start with one of my own and then move into the questions, if you don't mind, actually, Sarah. Because there's from the piece you wrote, there's kind of the other side to this. You spoke to MPs, and I was really struck by this. Well, you didn't speak to MPs, but you cite a lot of incidents of what MPs were saying. And I guess the thing I was wondering was, is there a piece of work to kind of understand how MPs feel about this issue as well, and to kind of understand where they are? Because we are, it's anecdotally, there's a lot of evidence. We talked about David Amess, we talked about Jo Cox. Like, where do we feel about where that sits?
I mean, I think the anecdotal evidence is tremendously on the side of when this type of harassment and abuse happens, what it does is it pushes people who maybe have otherwise very committed, like lifelong commitment to public service, to want to leave public service because it's not worth the risk to them, to themselves, to their families. And so what you see is candidates who ran who suffered abuse saying they wouldn't run again. You see people who have sat in office for a long time, and this is not just true in Britain, but in other places as well, saying that they're done when their term is up. But beyond the sort of anecdotal evidence, there is also sort of an increasing body of work now being done by researchers, including some based in London, that tries to look at surveys of MPs and candidates rather than surveys of the general public to understand whether these types of behaviors kind of shift their perspective about their longer term likelihood of staying in politics. And so I think that this is sort of an area which, for better or for worse, we're only kind of just getting into now, because I don't know how widespread abuse was in sort of thinking about pre-online times, but the internet and social media platforms have made this much more pervasive and much more kind of all-consuming. And actually, the second sort of part of that is that it's not just about the MPs and candidates themselves, but many of their staffers are actually the ones who help handle their social media feeds. And these people, who tend to be younger, oftentimes straight out of uni or things like that, these are the people who see this type of messaging directed at their MPs or their candidates. And the amount of stress and mental health kind of detriment this is having on them is increasingly, I suspect, going to be a part of the way researchers focus on this too. But I don't know if this is something that perhaps Rob actually wants to comment on as well. He knows this area pretty well.
Rob, is there anything you want to add So feel free, you don't have to.
I mean, not actually. I think it was a very clearly put. I think that I think what is striking when you listen to MPs talking or read their biographies or autobiographies is just how central to their lives this is, and how much they talk to each other and share notes about this kind of thing. And it is there were many reasons why a great number of Conservative MPs stood down at the last election, not all of which are, of course, to do with this, but it was definitely a common theme. And yeah, so it all redoubles the importance.
I guess it kind of feeds in. I might throw this question out too, that's come in from the audience. It's just kind of it's related, I guess. Is how would you feel if a family member or friend decided to become a politician? Does this work make you feel a bit? How does that? Is this something that makes you kind of go, actually, is this something that you'd want someone close to you to be involved with? Anybody who fancies it? We've got four, so I feel like I could start picking on people. Reed, I'm going to pick on you now. Apologies. This is what's going to
Sure.
happen. People don't put their hands up, they're going to get picked on. I apologize.
No, that's fine. No, that's actually a really good question, and it is something that I've thought about. I mean, personally, I would be in favor of it actually even more because the costs are high, but
Hmm.
and I I I haven't spent a lot of time speaking with politicians, not MPs anyway. I mean, I'm familiar with some more local politicians, but I know the stress and the cost that comes with the role. But I think it's 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 more important than ever for people who are committed, like Rob mentioned, to play an active role in politics. I think, for the benefit of kind of democratic values more broadly, I think we should encourage and support quality candidates to run for office. And I think our research is important because we're trying to, in some oblique way, trying to find ways to help ensure that those individuals aren't driven away from office, right, as a way to kind of help bolster the democratic norms that I'm sure everybody in this room supports. So, much as I would express a lot of concerns, for example, if, my daughter grew up and decided to run for public office, I would certainly be concerned for her safety and her mental health. But I would uh, I would be very much supportive of that. Apprehensive for sure, but I think it's important that, committed people who we think at least are fighting the good fight, stay in office and aren't driven away by the types of, hostility and toxicity that we see more and more.
And there's another question here, which I'm going to bring Graeme in, I think, on, which is, were you surprised the counter narratives were so ineffective?
Yes, I think I was. And since we've done other research, we do find like framing topics, highlighting issues, to make people think about areas. But I think it was partially down to the fact that there were so many people who were very unaccepting of the violence, and very so few people were accepting that. In fact, we probably didn't have a big enough sample to get the size of respondents that we can see the effect. We were close on empathy, right? So that might be something, if we had a slightly bigger sample of people that were in favor of violence, well, accepting of violence, or in favor of violence, we might see whether that could nudge them. But yeah, I think it was partly down to a consequence of a smaller sample. And then maybe also that these messages need reiterating over time. Just a quick sample, one question, one statement might not be enough to nudge them. So I think there's food for thought, and I think there might be some issues which we might explore further. But yeah, that was kind of disappointing for us and surprising.
Thanks, Graham. There's a question actually from Karen. It's directed to you, Rob. I wonder how much blame you would put at the door of MPs themselves. Are they encouraging this behaviour through their language and the way they attack the opposition?
The short answer to that is I would say some, but perhaps less than many people would. I mean, there is no doubt that the immediate or the post-Brexit referendum period was not an impressive one in terms of politicians' behaviour in a range of ways. And there was a fair bit of toxicity around. And I think in those circumstances, yes, there definitely is. There is some culpability there. And I think probably the majority, maybe even the large majority of MPs would be largely exempt from that. It tends again to be the more vivid cases that, and obviously the media will much prefer somebody who is encouraging that kind of behaviour with that kind of language than somebody who's being restrained. But the reason I would put or hesitate a bit on this is just, and it's by pure coincidence that earlier today I was reading something about politics in the 1950s, and I was reminded of that Bevan quote about how nothing will eliminate my hatred for the Tories. They are lower than vermin. And that's a great way of illustrating there was no golden age here where politicians were always all kind of polite and there weren't these kind of strong hatreds around. So I'm much more inclined to think that social media has the anonymity of social media has created a situation in which people who would not be like this in any other context are behaving like that and thus normalizing what's gone on.
Thanks, Rob. I think that's very interesting and kind of seems to chime with, I think, a lot of what we might see in around us at the moment too. There's a really interesting question here as well from somebody else's. As a result of your research, will you be pressing MPs to introduce more legislation to prevent people posting this kind of harmful content? That seemed to be the only that seemed to be the only thing that respondents seem to think would work. Sarah, I might bring you in on that, what you know, from that perspective.
I mean, so we're hoping that our research does a few things without us having to reach out to MPs directly, right? So we have had some meetings with different campaigners that are working to actually encourage the government to increase social media regulation. And so we're hoping that by picking up on the research that we're doing and what we're finding, that those campaigners have a bit stronger of a sort of case to make. And we have submitted comments to the House Committee addressing these issues as well. And so I do think that one of our goals would be that because what we are finding is very clearly public appetite for greater regulation and the role of the state in encouraging that regulation, that's important. One of the other things we didn't get a chance to discuss is we actually provided space for open-ended comments in the very first wave of the survey, and many of the comments about that people were making was, well, why would I report that social media platforms don't do anything anyway? Or I've reported these things before and no one's ever done anything. And so I think that it's not just enough to say that people have an appetite for greater regulation. It's also very clear that people very much think that social media companies are effectively not doing the job they're supposed to be doing, even though they say there are these rules in place. And so I do think that there's an element of that very clear policy implication that we're hoping gets picked up both by campaigners working on this issue, but then in sort of the way that we're hoping our research translates to direct recommendations to government.
And there's a question here from Report Potter, which I think speaks to some of what you're saying there, Sarah, about about recommendations on what might be possible. Do you think the ability to threaten anonymously using social media or comment sections of online publications increase the toxicity of the debate? Do you think having to own these comments would reduce this toxicity? I'm having a problem with that this evening. It's late. But yeah, but essentially, is online anonymity part of this issue? Is this part of the problem of what we have here? Is that one solution?
I mean, I guess my initial thought is that it's the sort of combination of anonymity and then a lack of fear that a platform will do anything anyway, kind of combined together, right? And I think the anonymity helps reinforce that perception that nothing will happen if you break the rules and you do these things. But I think that even where you have to officially register an account. If there's not a good way to kind of track that and make that person really held accountable other than removing that particular user from that platform, it's not really clear to me necessarily that just getting rid of the anonymity part without actual media platform regulation of the space will do it on its own. But I do think that being able to post this type of comment or make this type of comment or threat without having to own it is certainly encouraging people to probably go further than they might otherwise if they had to have their name or their image actually attached to the statement. Yeah, absolutely.
Graeme, is that something you might be interested in coming in on too, as someone you've been kind of looking at a lot of the policy implications of this? Is this the kind of space where you think things should be at, or is there other kind of things that you think might be better ways to try and address this issue?
I think regulation, I think anything that increases public confidence that something will be done, then increases their willingness to engage. The two areas Sarah mentioned were written comments. So we just asked them to write some comments about what they felt. The two areas that seemed to come up a lot were anonymity, keyboard warriors, right? We're talking about keyboard warriors a lot, and anonymity. I had to look at what keyboard warriors meant, and anonymity. And then the other thing was just that the companies won't do anything about it. And I think this might be a place for government regulation, one way or another, to try and sort of maybe reduce that anonymity or create a framework where if people conduct unacceptable behavior, they lose that anonymity. Right? And although there are consequences and risks to that as well. But certainly the social media companies need to be held responsible, right? And if there are problems on their platforms, they should do something about it. And if it don't seem like they're going to do anything about it, people are not going to report, and then it's not going to feel that they can engage safely in these spaces. I think this sort of anarchical system which we've got sort of going on is creating a lot of problems for individuals and their confidence, and for politicians and celebrities and many people out there, bullying and so forth.
Rob, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say two related things. One is that, of course, our data come from a representative sample of the public. What they don't come from is a representative sample of the kind of people who might be involved in the exchanges that we were mimicking. And that may be the explanation for what really struck me when we were designing the counter narratives, which was that we kind of had to improvise these because there weren't many examples of that. And that I think that would tend to inhibit this kind of threatening stuff online if people thought that there would then be a bit of a kind of outcry against it from other people involved in these exchanges. But maybe those people have just scattered. But yeah, you just rarely see online the kind of stuff that we were testing by way of counter narratives, which is striking given that I do think we're right that lots of people do think it's deplorable, and they should have the same kind of privacy or safety to criticize this, because they don't have to feel that the knife-threatening maniac will pursue them because they're also anonymous. But it just doesn't seem to pan out.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting response to that too. We're actually just bang on time, would you believe? It's exactly 9 o'clock. So I feel we've answered all the questions. Unless any of my four panelists have something burning that they want to get off their chest before we wrap up. I think all of it's left for me to do is to say a huge thank you to Graeme, to Reid, to Sarah, to Rob for their really, really interesting work